Some of you know that Refinitiv used to host annual conferences on oil market here in Moscow, but this time we are all facing an unprecedented challenge, and we all had to change our life and working style. So today we are having an online oil webinar, and we are really glad that we have an audience from around the globe today. Before we start, let me first introduce our speakers. We are honored today to hear the views of leading market experts from well-known and respected companies. Our first presenter is Sofia Donuts. Sofia leads financial and macroeconomic analysis at Renaissance Capital. Sofia brings over 10 years of experience in financial and macroeconomic analysis. In her most recent role, she led the regional analysis division at the Central Bank of Russia. I'd also like to welcome Damir Khalmetov, an LPG market expert from Thomson Reuters. In his recent roles, Damir was also engaged in the analysis of oil and oil product markets. As a former colleague of his, I'd like to mention that Damir is quite a famous LPG expert, and his views and expertise are always highly appreciated on the market. And finally, we have Adam Sikorsky, a president of the management board of Unimod Capital Group, one of the largest private companies on the energy market in Poland. Thank you very much for coming. We are looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Before we kick off, let me give you a rundown of some technical features of the webinar. Firstly, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A window, and we'll answer them after the session. And I would kindly ask you to indicate who exactly you'd like to answer the question. You're also welcome to use the toolbar at the bottom of the webinar screen to access resources such as speaker biographies, webinar materials, and technical support. And we would also highly appreciate if you could complete our survey, which can also be accessed from the toolbar. You can do it at any time during the webinar, so we would be glad to have your feedback. Now we've covered all that, let's just get started. Sofia, if you wouldn't mind, could you go ahead and tell us more about the macroeconomic consequences of the pandemic and challenges we'll possibly face in the future? Sofia, can you hear me well?
Yeah, thank you, Yulia. Thank you for your presentation. Hello, everyone. Nice to speak to you today. So I'll try to give you just a brief view on macroeconomic trend, focusing on Russia definitely, but also touching the region as a whole. So just before, when we're preparing this presentation, we discussed should we talk about longer term trends, but definitely it's clearly clear this year we live in such different conditions, such a different reality. So we definitely should focus on the effect of the current crisis to all the economies, and we see this, could see this as a testing time for economies that we look at. So. And probably the main thing is that we all of us, all countries, are going through the same crisis, through the same shock, but all economies reacted to this crisis quite differently, and the different scenes is seen in everywhere, like starting from measuring and testing and the dynamics of cases or fatalities, to the policy response and precautionary measures and the timing and all those things. So if we look at Russia and CIS region, CIS plus region, the thing that we should highlight is that overall dynamics of cases was quite decent. So over the region, in Russia, Belarus and Moldova, the number of active cases per 1 million was the highest. While in some countries, like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the number of cases is so very low that it's like 20 times lower than in UK or US or Southern Europe. So two things here that help to subdue the virus. First is a relatively early policy response and precautionary measures adopted. The second probably is, sorry, my presentation is changing. And the second thing is the demographics. So half of the CIS plus region is relatively young. So the share of younger population is higher. So and unfortunately the other half is a little bit more on the aging side. But still overall demographic burden is lower than in most European countries. And while we entered quarantine period later than Europe, we are now well on the way of easing of quarantine restrictions. So we still cannot be 100% sure that we will not face the second wave of pandemic, both domestically or globally. But what we see is clearly that the second wave won't be as harmful as the first wave, both in terms of the costs of adjustments, both for businesses and the governments, and also in terms of the virus per se, so the reaction of population and the rate of active cases or fatalities. Just because we believe that we will see some improvement, we will see some guarantees from the healthcare system in coming months. So the second difference, apart from the demographics and apart from the starting point of the crisis, was the policy response. What we see now this year, we will see unprecedented anti-crisis fiscal stimulus all over the world. And I would highlight that both in Central and Eastern European region and the CIS plus region, governments were ready to offer quite sizable fiscal packages, which are more closer at the scale, closer to the developed market, as Germany or UK. They're still lower than US. So probably the communication about anti-crisis packages and a wording of this was quite different in different countries. So we've heard countries saying that they're going to spend 20% of GDP on supporting the economy or 40% of GDP on supporting the economy. But in the end of the day, we argue that to really estimate the real effect of the fiscal stimulus, we should look at hard data. We should look at how large is going to be their expansion of the fiscal position, so expansion of the fiscal deficit in the country. So this is the real number that show you how much additional money will add the government to the economy. Just because if you just cancel all other your expenditures and redistribute it to anti-crisis measures, then the net effect to the economy will not be that supportive, just because it's just a redistribution of money. So the new money is the expansion of fiscal balances. So we'll look at this number, and in these terms we see stimulus of close 5 to 6% of GDP in CIS countries like Kazakhstan or Russia or Georgia or Ukraine, which is again close to Germany or UK. And we see also stimulus at 1 to 3 percentage point of GDP in smaller countries of the region, which is still close to the stimulus which are offered for by emerging market and frontier market peers with the same ratings. So again, I believe that the fiscal support will be crucial this year, and I would say that our region really offering quite a nice fiscal stimulus this year. So, and the real question is whether it could affect the fiscal sustainability and the fiscal positions, and whether it will trigger a kind of fiscal consolidation in coming years. And the fact is that, surprisingly, those countries which were most sensitive to commodity price slump this year end up to be more well equipped to withstand the crisis in terms of fiscal position, just because they have all kinds of rainy day funds. So they don't. They partially will redistribute the burden of the crisis towards using the fiscal savings, not only expanding the government debt, which definitely is not that easy in current market conditions. So in the end of the day, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, which are most sensitive to the oil price weakness this year, will offer the largest fiscal stimulus in the region, and will have the most robust fiscal position by the end of 2020. So turning to the growth outlook, it seems like this year we're going to have the deepest recession in recent decades. So you can say lots of words about whether it's gonna be deepest in a century, or deepest in a century and a half, or it will and we definitely will have so many countries affected. So it's extraordinary, large-scale crisis, like a worldwide crisis. But in the end of the day, what is important, so more on the positive side, I would say that we expect this crisis to be a short-lived. So we do expect to see a fast growth rebound in 2021 after a recession this year. So it was like, like kind of a supply side shock. So some exogenous shock to economies. And we do think that as soon as the situation with virus is stabilized, economies will have a good position to resume growth. And the second thing is that we do believe that countries of our region are well positioned to withstand this crisis better than many other emerging market and even developed market peers. And this is due to a number of factors. So when we look at the growth outlook for this year, we bear in mind, a range of sensitivities, the range of channels through which crisis could affect the economy. So we look at the share of commodities, both in terms of share in the GDP and the share of export. We look at the share of tourist-related sectors in the GDP, because these sectors are going to be affected quite hard this year. And we look at the net tourist flow. So sometimes, even if you have quite active domestic tourism, you have also a large outflow of tourism. So your country spends a lot abroad. So in these terms, you can even benefit from the closure of borders and the restrictions of government tourism, of international tourism. So the third thing that we look at is the room for fiscal maneuver. So the fiscal sustainability, again, whether the country have some savings, and what is the level of the government debt. So what is the room for maneuver in terms of fiscal stimulus for this year. And the fourth is that we look at the situation on the labor market, we look at the initial rate of unemployment, the share of more sustainable sectors in the economy like state sector, state services, or agriculture, and such things which are less affected. So in a combination, it gives us the view that Russia, for example, can withstand this crisis with only 2.5 contraction this year, which is close to what the IMF is expecting as a global average contraction for this year. So in the end of the day, such things like a low share of small and medium enterprises, a higher share of state sector into the system, the lower initial unemployment, and the more robust employment throughout the crisis should decrease costs of the crisis to the Russian economy, though Russia is still highly affected by the crisis through the commodity channel. So looking at these external sensitivities, so what we see is that Russia is definitely a kind of regional leader in terms of the share of fuel commodities into export. So fuel commodities cover up to 70% of export, while metals add additional from 10 to 50%. So overall, the share of commodities into export is coming to closer to 80% of export. So it's not the largest in the region. So just because we have Azerbaijan with close to 99% of commodities into export, and we have Kazakhstan with close to 80, which is close to Russia. So, but in a perspective of the region, it's still quite large. It's still quite high sensitivity. So, but for this year, I would say that the weakness of prices is not the worst news for Russia. It's a combination of the weakness of oil prices together with the effect of the OPEC Plus deal. So we expect this year the fuel export to contract by close 8% in year terms. If we have the overall 2020, and we expect the export growth to stay low in 2021. So it definitely will put a burden both in terms of growth and in terms of current account, but the effect of the fiscal rule and gradually delink ruble from the weakness of oil prices. So what we see now is that ruble is tremendously, sustainable for current situation. So, and from the other side, we look at the share of GDP the level of net travel receipts of the country. So how much the country spends or gain from international tourism. So, and then if we look at our region, we definitely have a leader, which is Georgia, with almost close to 15% of GDP of net receipts from tourism. So this country is hit the most by the lockdown and the lack of international tourism. And who is gaining the most is surprisingly Ukraine, just because Ukrainians spent by 5 percentage points of GDP more abroad than the Ukraine gets from the inflow of tourism. So, and again, Russia, Kazakhstan, they are all on the positive side, however, with a lower proportion than Ukraine, but still on the positive side. So they have a gain from the restrictions on international tourism, while Hungary and clearly Turkey suffers from and also Czech Republic or Poland. In the end of the day, they will have some negative effects, additional negative effects of the crisis through this channel. And turning back to a fiscal space, so the space for fiscal stimulus, what we see is that for some countries of the region have still quite low level of public debt, and here we absolutely should mention Russia with the government debt below 20% of GDP. It is so very low. So it gives a lot of space to additional fiscal stimulus, and we expect this year Russia to temporarily ease the fiscal rule to provide additional anti-crisis stimulus, which will gonna be mostly financed by additional placement of local currency debt. And it still leaves us with below 20% public debt by the end of this year. So it's quite a reasonable reaction from fiscal position. And on the other side, we have Ukraine and Belarus with more elevated public debt. It could pose some constraints on the scale of the fiscal stimulus. However, both these countries that I have mentioned, Ukraine and Belarus, will gain from the help and additional financing from the side of international financial organizations. That this help is going to help both countries to balance both current account, balance of payment, and the fiscal balance this year. So if we look at currency, we see a nice rally in all emerging market currency space during recent weeks. So it's driven by an anticipation of the improvement of the global situation. So the markets are pricing the positive news on the decrease of the COVID cases globally. However, I would expect that this rally will not be that sustainable. So I would be cautious about this. So if we look at emerging market currency, and you see that for now they are close to that level that they have pre-crisis, then definitely you should be cautious about this. So probably it's an overreaction of markets, just because on a recovery phase for all these countries, we can have import growth recovery faster than export growth, so outpacing the export growth. So in recent months, the import dropped by from 20 to 30% in most countries of CIS plus region. And so it is a huge drop, and it was not only driven by income dynamics or preferences, but it was directly restricted by quarantine measures, by quarantine restrictions. So we definitely expect some recovery in import that could outpace the recovery of export, putting additional pressure on these currencies. So so I would say that for most currencies we see some moderate depreciation potential in the second half of this year, and however, we do not expect currencies to be back on the maximum levels of end March or start of April, just because, again, we expect that even if we have a global second wave, we won't have that negative reaction, both in terms of market and business adjustment and the government finances. So just one more macroeconomic indicator that we should look at during this crisis, and probably looking to after the crisis, period after the crisis, is the inflation dynamics and monetary policy. So unlike all previous crises, central bank of emerging market, this time offered quite sizable monetary policy easing, following the dynamics of the developed market rates. So again, it was quite different just because from previous crises, and probably the reason was that actually we left the kind of a situation when you have a textbook central bank and a textbook economy, just because we are we have effectively we had a restriction of functioning of markets through these recent months. And we find ourselves in a kind of mobilization economies. So probably it's reasonable to have as much domestic stimulus as you can if you have such a severe slowdown of economic activity and effectively you have a market disruption. So, but I would argue that as soon as we are back to a more normal, more market-based economies, we probably could have some counter-reaction of both in terms of inflation rate and central bank rates for some emerging markets, probably, but not all of them, just because I believe that those emerging markets in our regions that are more exposed to European Union, so closer to European Union, for them, I would expect the deflationary factors to be more strong and inflation to be lower. But for some countries of the region, including Russia, I would expect that in the end of the day, inflation rate could be more elevated and more sustainable, calling for some reaction from the central bank, not in terms of tightening, definitely, but in terms of normalization of the rate, so going back to neutral rates, closer to neutral rates, already in 2021. So, and it could be reasonable just because, as I've mentioned before, governments are offering such an expansive government support from the fiscal side, then probably this large fiscal stimulus should be balanced by monetary policy. So, and this affects our view on rates and on the monetary policy stance in coming years. So it's pretty much all I wanted to mention during my presentation. So I will stop here and will leave a space for questions.
Thanks so much, Sophia. It's really great to hear your take on the current situation. I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Sophia, please post them in the Q&A window. And please do not forget to complete that survey as well. Okay, then let's get closer to the oil topic and find out what's happening on the Russian oil market. So it's not a secret that 2020 has been extremely challenging so far in all aspects, including our new life cycle and, of course, the situation of the oil market as well. Moving on to the first slide. OPEC cooperation has become the key factor during the recent months. OPEC Plus agreement has been supporting the market over the last years and demonstrated that cooperation between the largest producers inside and outside OPEC is possible and quite effective. Key members of the deal have been showing quite a high level of commitment during these years. But it begs the question, what's wrong with 2020, which turned out to be completely different compared to the previous years in terms of the negotiation process. OPEC and non-OPEC producers failed to extend the oil cut deal earlier this year, which led to an unprecedented fall in prices. Oil prices declined by half over just a few days. I'm not going to focus on these, but the chart on the left shows the futures dynamic, which speaks for itself. And COVID-19 obviously put downward pressure on prices and increased volatility. But fortunately, OPEC and other producers, led by Russia, agreed in April to a record cut in output to prop up oil prices amid the coronavirus pandemic. The group agreed to reduce output for May and June by 9.7 barrels per day, and just a few days ago, they agreed again to extend these cuts until the end of July. Russia's and Saudi obligations under the deal are to cut their production by 2.5 million barrels per day from 11 million barrels per day baseline, while other members are allowed to cut from November 2018 level. There are some old and new parties in this deal. For instance, some OPEC countries didn't join this recent agreement, as their production had already been affected by other events, such as sanctions, unfavorable economics, and so on. There are also some new members indicated on the upper right chart, which is supposed to collectively cut output by around 5,000 barrels per day. At the same time, such countries as the US, Canada, Brazil, and Norway refused to formally join the deal but may cut production due to unfavorable economics. Russian oil companies are considering cutting production mainly at the mature fields, by which I mean brownfields. If we have a look at the next slide, we can see some more details on the Russian oil production dynamic. Russian oil and gas condensate production rose by about 1% over January-April period compared to the same time last year. Production dynamic in Russia in 2020 varied from company to company. For instance, Russian giant Rosneft, which accounts for about 35% of the country's output, as well as Tatneft, saw a decline in production, both in March and April of 2020 compared to the previous year, while other majors increased their output ahead of May and June cuts. As regarding to oil refining, it increased slightly by 3% from January to April 2020 compared to the same period last year. Refining dynamic also varied from company to company, as oil majors were kind of struggling to come up with an optimal decision to balance maintaining their share of the global market with fulfilling their obligations on the domestic market. The coronavirus lockdown in Russia started with a delay in April. So in March, there were no clear signs of the scale of the decline in the domestic consumption. Companies were operating as usual and sometimes on higher capacities ahead of summer refinery outages period. And the next slide shows how Russian exports behaved under these obligations and volatility. As I mentioned earlier, Russian production and exports followed their seasonal trends. This sharp increase in April on the upper left chart looks like that only because of low exports in March, due to different factors, again, volatility, or low prices, weak demand, and increased competition. Russian main oil export grade, Urals, suffered from this slump in oil prices and increased competition on the European market. As its differential to Dated Brent weakened both in Northwest Europe and the Mediterranean region, the discount to Brent reached more than 10-year lows, making the exports much more unprofitable. There is also another export price indicator on the Russian domestic market called netback. Netback is a kind of indicator used to estimate whether it's more profitable to supply crude to the domestic market or to export. Netback is calculated from global oil price minus transport costs, as well as taking into account taxes and duties. As can be seen from the upper right chart, NABEX were even negative in April and then slightly recovered with oil prices. It meant that in these kind of periods, it's extremely unprofitable to export crude. Domestic prices also declined, but were more stable than NABEX. So spreads between NABEX and domestic prices widened to as much as 15,000 rubles per ton during April. Let's look at the exports in more detail, moving on to the next slide. The dynamic here was quite similar to production and refining dynamic, and it again varied from company to company. The overall exports fell by around 2% over the January to April period of 2020 against the same period last year. On the left chart are shown Russian oil exports by destination. Flows highlighted in green saw an increase in supplies. Flows in red a decline, while flows in gray were almost flat over this period. So the most considerable decline in exports was in those to Belarus. This plunge was connected with termination of oil supplies to Belarus since January, because Russian oil companies and Belarus failed to agree on a price. As a result of that, only a few Russian companies continued their exports to the country. But there was also a positive dynamic seen in key ports in the northwest and far east of Russia, as well as in overall exports to China. Moving on to the next slide, if we look at the monthly export dynamic, it's interesting to note that there was some companies which saw an uptrend in exports, and this recovery was seen mainly in April. For example, Rosneft boosted its seaborne exports to Primorsk and Kozmino seaports, as well as to Belarus, supplies to which were resumed in April by all Russian companies. A fall in oil prices finally led Belarus and Russia to agree on a fair price. Moving on to the next slide, as I mentioned before, the overall decrease in exports was mainly connected with lower demand and a decrease in prices. But in this case, there was another key factor, which was downward pressure from Saudi Arabia and increased competition as a result of that. As shown on the upper charts, Russian main export grade, Urals, is still top of the list for European consumption, both in Northwest Europe and the Mediterranean. But as can be seen on the charts, Saudi's share increased considerably in the European consumption basket in March and April this year, both in Northwest Europe and the Mediterranean, especially in Northwest Europe, which is not typical at all. Saudis were in negotiations with such traditional buyers of Russian Urals as Finnish Neste, Swedish Prim, French Total, and so on. If we look at the bottom charts, we will see cracking refinery margins in Northwest Europe and the Mediterranean region. The dynamic speaks for itself again. In March, there was a sharp increase in Arab light crude margin, which is probably related to the discounts offered by Saudi Arabia. So it generally fluctuated depending on the oil price, the current demand for oil products in the region, and refinery yields of each particular crude. And finally, let's look at the seaborne exports of oil products from Russia. Motor fuels were obviously among those that suffered the most because of the lockdown. There is a slight increase in diesel and fuel oil in March and for gasoline in April, which was mainly because of the lower domestic demand. As we know, the lockdown in some European countries has been relaxed. This means there will be more regional traveling and consumption of diesel and gasoline as well. While jet consumption remains uncertain, so it's still heavily connected with the situation around the globe. So in conclusion then, for now, the situation on the oil market, as any other markets, remain uncertain. However, there are some positive signs. There are some positive signs. Oil prices are recovering. They reached quite a favorable level both for producers and buyers. OPEC plus cooperation is still a key factor, but fundamentals, namely the demand and macroeconomic condition, will lead the market. Of course, we all hope that there will not be any trade wars or new political tensions or a second wave of coronavirus, but unfortunately, all these factors are worth keeping in mind. Thanks for listening. On this note, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A window. And also, please do not forget to complete our survey as well. So I didn't cover LPG market in my review, but we are lucky to have Damir Khametov here with us. Central and Eastern Europe is quite a large consumer of LPG. So it's interesting to find out what's happening on that market at the moment. Damir, if you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and tell us some more details related to the LPG market.
Thank you, Irina, for introducing me. I would like to thank Refinitiv company for inviting me and possibility to make a presentation about LPG market in Russia and former Soviet Union region. The main topics of my presentation are Russian LPG market in 2015, 2019, how production and consumption in Russia changed during this period, LPG export trade flows from Russia by ports and land terminals, Russian LPG market focused in 2025, how new points of production and consumption of LPG in Russia will affect the market balance, and a few words about Kazakhstan and Ukrainian LPG market in 2015-2019 years. On this slide, we can see the main facts about Russian LPG market. Russia produces about 5% of the world LPG production. Russia is on the second place in the world after gas consumption and has about 4,900 LPG petrol stations. Russia is in top 10 of the world LPG seaborne trading countries. We have 3 LPGC terminals, Ust-Luga with capacity 2.4 million ton annual on the Baltic Sea, Taman with capacity 1.5 megaton annual, and Temryuk with capacity 0.5 megaton annual in the Azov and Black Sea region. About 60 oil and gas processing plants are producing LPG in Russia. Also in Russia, more than 350 wholesale terminals, gas filling stations. On this slide, we can see production, consumption, and export statistic data about LPG market in Russia during last 5 years. LPG production increased slowly, mainly thanks to Sibur and the Tobolsk gas refinery in West Siberia. In 2019, additional LPG volumes to the market came from the Irkutsk oil company and Gazprom refineries. Consumption in Russia was stable before last year. Last year, Sibur started LPG shipments to the new petrochemical plant plant Zapsibneftekhim, which affected consumption and export flows. Production of LPG in Russia this year, according to our calculations, may decrease by around 1 million tons due to reduction in the supply of associated petroleum gas and natural gas liquids from oil fields due to a drop in oil production in Russia as part of the OPEC Plus deal. And the export of LPG from Russia this year can decrease significantly because the main exporter, Sibur, has plans to feed the Zapsib plant for producing more marginal petrochemical products. Sibur started shipments to Zapsib in August last year, and total shipments by pipeline from gas refinery in Tobolsk to Zapsib in this location too, till April has already exceeded 1.1 million tons. According to our estimates, Zapsib is now loaded at 60-70% of its capacity of consumption, or around 160,000 tons of LPG per month. Zapsib's capacity for consuming LPG as a feedstock and maximum loading is 2.7 million tons per year, and the company plans to reach this maximum loading in 2021. On this slide, we can see destinations and sectors of LPG consumption in Russia compared with the global market. Total consumption in Russia last year was 11.1 million tons. 33% and 23% out of this volume went to chemical plants as a feedstock and transport sector as avtogas. 22% of LPG consumed in internal processing as refineries, and 19% and 3% of LPG went to residential and industrial sector. Low values of the last two sectors compared to the global structure of LPG consumption, we can decrease with a wide access to natural gas in Russia, which usually cheaper than LPG. We have two main ways of LPG export from Russia: seaborne export by port terminals and railway export by land terminals directly to neighborhood countries. The share of shipments through Ust-Luga port terminal was 87% of total seaborne export from Russia. Through other two terminals on Russian territory in Krasnodar region, Tamань and Temryuk, LPG terminals shipped 5 and 6%. And smaller part of LPG volumes went to the export through seaborne terminals in Ukraine and Baltic countries. On this slide, we can see the LPG export from 2018-29. We can see the stable share of shipments to other regions, to the Netherlands and to Poland and to Scandinavian country, to Finland. And increasing of LPG shipments to Estonia terminal, but this not the directly consumption in Estonia region, because main part of these volumes transferred by ship-to-ship operation to very large gas carriers and exported to Asia Pacific region. This year, Sibur started direct LPG supplies from Ust-Luga to India because European demand fell sharply during the lockdown, and we know about two LPG tankers to that region, and in April, and one tanker shipments to Oman in May. On this slide, we can see LPG exports from Taman port terminal by destination in 2018-2019. We can see the significantly decreasing of LPG exports through this terminal because Russian companies transferred the volumes from this terminal to more premium and marginal markets in Ukraine, in Russia, and other destinations. But the share of shipments to Turkey in around 50% last year, and we can see the stable volumes to Balkan countries. During last 2 years and this year, we can speak only about Kazakhstan LPG region to this terminal, and only in April and May, few Russian producers exported through Taman terminal some volumes because the situation and traditional market in Poland, in Ukraine, and in Russia was very negative. In this slide, we can see the main top 5 countries in railway LPG export from Russia. We can see that share of Belarus last year was around 32%, but a lot of these volumes shipped through Belarus to Poland and other countries of Eastern Europe. Direct shipments to Poland by railway last year was around 25%. Next one, main buyers of Russian LPG is Ukraine, with share around 20% of total export by railway. On this slide, you can see our calculation based on companies and market data, and we can see that LPG production in Russia can rise during next 5 years from 16 million tons to 24 million tons, thanks to new projects. This year, LPG production will increase thanks to Rospan project in West Siberia with capacity 1.2 megaton annual in this year and next year. Irkutsk Oil Company in Eastern Siberia with a new gas processing plant with capacity 1 million ton annual in 2021. Amur gas processing plant in the far east of Russia with capacity 1.6 million ton annual in 3 steps. First step will be next year in April, and during 4 years they will reach this volume. And thanks to big project in Ust-Luga by Gazprom and Rusgasdobыча company, and with a capacity of LPG production around 2.4 million ton annual in 2023-2024. Export from Russia will double during 2021-2025. The main destination in export this year will be the same as in 2019. It's our region, Eastern Europe, Mediterranean country, and we can expect increasing of railway shipments to China. And if we speak about first LPG tanker shipments from the far east of Russia, it's likely to start next year. Consumption will increase. Consumption in Russia will increase mainly in 2020 and 2021 thanks to Zapsibneftekhim. Sibur during this period will reduce export by approximately 2 million ton per year to feed this plant, and consumption in the residential sector and the Avtogas sector in Russia will rise by 3-4% per year. A few words about Kazakhstan market. Production in 2019 LPG in Kazakhstan was 3.2 million ton. Consumption in Kazakhstan 1.4 million ton, and export around 1.8 million ton last year. We can on the right side of the slide we can see the destinations by country. The main volumes from Kazakhstan went to Tajikistan, Ukraine, and we can see that last year the main and exporter of LPG from Kazakhstan, Tengiz Chevroil company, stopped shipments through Port Odessa in Ukraine and transferred these volumes to Temryuk and Taman port terminals in Russian territory. A few words about Ukraine market in 2015-2019. We can see that consumption in Ukraine doubled from 1 million ton to 2 million ton per year during these 5 years. The share of domestic production was stable around 400,000 tons of LPG, and all other volumes comes from export. And main three exporters of LPG to Ukraine is Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan. And last year we can see the increasing share of shipments from other countries, for example, from Poland, from Baltic countries, and first shipments of LPG production from United States. It was not direct shipments from US country. It was US origin LPG and shipped to Ukraine by ship-to-ship operation from very large gas carriers to small tankers in Cyprus and Greece region. Thanks a lot for your attention, and thanks Irina and other participants too.
Thanks, Damir, for such a comprehensive review. That's really insightful. So it was interesting to hear the view from the supply side, but let's see what's the situation on the demand side. We're delighted to have Adam Sikorsky from the Heart of Europe. So, Adam, would you mind telling us some insights on what's going on in the market in terms of the demand side? Adam, can you hear me well? Adam, can you hear me well? Okay, great. Please go ahead.
Sorry, maybe now is better.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So good morning again. Happy to be here today with you. I will try to give you some overview about the Polish market and as well the pandemic effect on the demand on the Polish market. So briefly, we as a Unimod, we are the biggest independent player on the Polish market. Since 2016, our company is representing Avia in Poland and in Ukrainian market as well. We are developing Avia petrol stations on both two markets. Our business sectors is focusing on the petrol, fuels, liquid gas, natural gas, electricity, and as well bitumen is a new desk for us. We started this operation last year. So some market overview where we are with Poland when we are talking about the 2019. The economy in Poland for the last 20 years, since we joined European Union 2004, was really, really strong. We had more than 4%, 4.5% GDP growth for 2019. So we were quite optimistic entering 2020. You can see for the numbers the consumption of the liquid fuels in Poland, the gasoline, diesel, jet, and LPG. So of course the driver is a diesel with still very healthy demand last year, and the market increase around 6%. Gasoline as well, and very important, this is something related to the Damir session. The Poland is one of the biggest market for the LPG in the Europe. What is very important to say, we are fundamental short in Poland. It means that local productions, which are covered by two refineries, Orlen and Lotos, they cannot meet local demand. So we are fundamental importers of most of the fuels. For gasoline, for example, we are, I can say, neutral. We have some export out of Poland. We are very short with the diesel. We are a little bit still long with the jet fuels, but this is only for 2019 because now situation changed dramatically. And we are fundamental short for LPG. 80% of the local consumption is import from the third-party countries. if we need to import, we don't have Polish downstream, I can say. We have only 3.5% of the local demand for the crude oil is covered by the local production. As you can see, the biggest exporter of the crude oil to Poland is still Russia. This percentage of the market penetration by Russia is decreasing, as 20 years ago the market penetration was 100%. And now you can see that we have new players on the market, especially quite aggressive Saudi Aramco, having already 14%, and for the first quarter of 2020, especially because of the very aggressive prices on April and May, I assume that the market share for Saudi Aramco crude increased in Poland even up to 20%. But still, Russia is the number one. Reason is very simple. Everybody understands this. We still have a pipeline connection with Russia through Friendship Druzhba pipeline. So from the logistic point of view, this is the best supplier if we are talking about the crude. As I said, we need to import some products, mainly LPG and the diesel. So as is visible here, 53% of the local demand, 53% of the import basket, I call it like that, it is a diesel import. So this is really driver for the importing companies, distribution company like the Unimod. This is our main products. This is our main, I can say, trading desk is focusing on the diesel, and number two is LPG. We still have some import of the gasoline, mainly coming from Germany and Slovakia, but I will talk about this a little bit later on. Again, by the countries, so if we need to import gasoline, the question mark is from where the product is coming from. Here is visible. The two main players is Slovakia and Germany. Slovakia, Slovnaft refinery from the Bratislava. So they are covering south of Poland, mainly very industrial region in Silesia. And as well, two German refineries from Schwedt and Leuna. They are covering western part of Poland. Mainly the most of the supplies, they even came by truck directly to the petrol stations, to the final buyers, even no RTCs delivers. But situation is completely different when we are talking about the diesel. So 53% of the imported diesel product to Poland is covered by Russia. 18% is Germany. When the Germany for the last, I can say, 10 years, they decreased their presence on the Polish market significantly. 2010, the number was around 40% covered by German, but because of very strong demand in Germany, I think the local markets in Germany is more attractive for the German exporters. Lithuania as a number 3, we know that Morzej Kai refinery owned by Polish entity Orlen. So this is the intra-import, we call it like that, because other independent players, we cannot participate in this stream coming from the Lithuania, because this is the transaction between mother and the daughter company, sister company in the Lithuania. Low number, if we see for the Belarusia, just 8.9%. This is a little bit surprise because it's a neighbor country with two refineries located not far from the Polish borders. But already we heard from the previous speakers the issues of the supply of the crude oil in the Belarusia, and as well the Russian producers are quite aggressive and they have a constant delivery to Poland. So from this perspective, the Belarusia, I believe in the future they will try to grab more market presence in Poland, but unfortunately for now they are just number 4 if we are talking about the volumes. Pandemic issue, a little bit giving you overview where we are and what's happened in Poland. So as in many countries in Europe, the government takes several measures. So on 24th of March, the government has introduced the movements restriction, very strong restriction. So the borders were closed, airport was closed, the people were not allowed to go outside the apartments, the flat, without a very specific reason, going to work or visiting the convenience store to buy the food. And it was really strict, prevented by the police, as well the 14 days quarantine for any Poles who come back to the country after visiting the neighbor countries or other countries. So you can see that the red lines, the numbers of the infections every day. So on the beginning of April, we can see around 400 up to 500 infections every day. And we see it was quite stable for the long period. So this is one of the reasons that on the 20th of April, government decides to relax a little bit these limitations of the movements. So step by step, the economy starts to recover. So where we are now? We are now on the second wave in Poland. It is a lot of discussion if this was the right decision to relaxing already all limitations. So for yesterday, we had the record number of the infection, 600. As I understand, we call this second wave. We don't know if this is really second wave. Probably it is a second wave. The good issue is that this is more local issues. So, for example, the region I mentioned already, Silesia, south of Poland, with a lot of coal mines. This is the region which is most affected now by the second wave. So there is 600 I mentioned infection, 400 is coming from this region. So probably it will be local issues, but we are really looking forward what will happen, as on the end of June we will have a presidential election, which is already postponed from the April originally scheduled on the beginning of May. Sorry, on the 10th of May. So the government postponed the presidential election. And now is already scheduled for the 28th of June, and we believe that it will happen, I can say, because if the second wave will increase or speed up, there will be really challenging issue for us. This is something which is coming source from the Apple, the Apple and the Google and other operators. They try to follow what we are doing with our mobile phones. So it's now very easy to tracking the movements. So as I mentioned, on the 24th of April, limitation of the movements, so immediately decrease of the movements by car and by foot, and then stable on the up to the 20th of April, when they relax starting. And slowly, so people were afraid to go outside. They were watching what is going on in the media, in the news, and step by step, I can say they start to socialize again outside their apartments. But we are still not on the same level as before the pandemic, so January, February. And we are looking forward to when it's happened and if it will happen this year. How this affect the business? This is the most important part, I think, for all of you. So as we can see, of course, as in any countries, other countries, if you have a limited number of the movements of your potential customers, you can expect decrease of the sales. So in retail station, gasoline, a huge decrease, 60 to 70%, and for LPG even more, up to 80%. A little bit less, I can say a little bit, because in the normal market condition, when we are talking about the 30% drop is a catastrophic, but in this condition, 30% in the diesel decrease, we were very happy as a market players. We said, okay, this sector was not very affected by the decrease, but it was, so 30%, while reason very simple, logistic transport, you need to keep the movements of the food and the critical products deliveries. So this market was not very affected. Sales in the stores at the station, second picture. So convenience business, completely dead, I can say. It is 80 to 90%, but on the sum of the stores, it was even 95%. And what was the even worse side, that completely no activity from the food side. So the hot dogs, sandwich, you were not allowed to sell. It was limited by the law. And as well the coffee. The coffee, you know, is a really driver in the many gas stations. This is the #1 product, and you were not allowed to sell even if your customers asked to buy the coffee. So it has huge influence to the margin created by the gas stations. So it was really difficult. In our network, we are operating now more than 50 gas stations in Poland. We start, I can say, the retail business on the 2016. So after 4 years of the activity in this sector, we have the 50%. And as you can see, we were not so exposed for this huge decrease. 2030, it's still a lot, but much less than from the market and other market players. Why? Because our locations are mainly not on the huge cities like Warsaw, Krakow, Poznań. We are on the smaller cities and as well on the countryside, so the villages. And in these areas, the people, they will start to try to keep moving to doing some agriculture and something like that. So our sales dropped maximum 30%, but on the average around 20%. So we were very happy. Totally, not talking about the retail only. So LPG already I mentioned on the earlier slide, 70%, and I can say the jet fuel, so 95%. Since government has introduced the limitation of the movements, there were no flight at all in Poland, not only international flight, but as well domestic. Domestic flights start to be restarted just 1 week ago, and international probably from the 1st July, but we are not still sure that they will really restart. So it's really challenging issue for the local carrier, LOT, very strong airline before the pandemic, very active in the region from Poland and as well from the second hub in Budapest in the Hungary. But now I can say almost dead as we see. From the production side, in April, so in the moment of the already limited movements because of the government restriction, we have seen the positive margins, and as well because of the maintenance schedule already planned before the pandemic, we saw that there were not so huge pressure to the refineries in the Poland. So they were working as they planned to work before. But because of the change of the structure of the consumption, so huge decrease in the gasoline and the decrease on the LPG consumption, even they saw quite healthy demand for the diesel, or decreased 20-30%, as I mentioned before. For them, they were not possible to continue the production on the normal output. So finally, they have to decide to reduce the production for 20-30%, depends to the refineries. And they are still working on those mode from our informations. So they are not working on the full capacity. Even as I mentioned before, they still have a strong demand for the diesel, but they cannot produce only diesel. Everybody who knows the setup of the refineries, it's not possible to produce only one specific fuel. You have to produce almost full range from this perspective. So from our perspective as a Unimod, we have been not affected by the coronavirus because of the factors I mentioned already before. The Poland needs to import the diesel fuel because the local production was not okay and not fulfill the local demand in the Polish market. Even the Orlen and Lotos, they decide for on April to stop the import of the diesel. They restart import immediately after they decide to reduce the output of the refineries. So from our perspective, we are still okay. We were afraid a little bit on the beginning of April what's happened if the gap between demand and the local production will be narrowed to almost zero, if there will be still market for us to operate on the market. But looks, nothing happened, even opposite. The price structure on the international markets help us a lot. Last slide, last information by countries. So as I mentioned before, we are net importer, so market decrease. So how it affect export countries? Number one exporter, Russia, huge decrease, 50%. Why? Because we are the biggest, as a Unimod, the biggest independent importer, as I mentioned before, but Orlen and Lotos, they are importing from this direction as well. So when they stopped import in the April, immediately it have effect, I can say, the exporters. And the North hub in Gdańsk, it is one of the most important point for us, for Poland to import. So we see 50% decrease of the import from this direction. This is very visible, immediately visible on the market. Before pandemic, we were fighting for the discharging window with other players on the market. April, May, relax, no problem. We can grab any discharging window in the local terminals without any problems. Germany, number two, if you remember from my previous slide, 20-30% decrease because limitation of the production in the Schwedt refinery and Leuna. So what does it mean? As we understand, typical strategy for the German refineries is that they are covering their sales with 70% by the long-term commitment, so yearly contracts, and 30% is spot volumes. They try to play on the spot market. So since April, there is no spot volume available on the spot market. So only what they are doing now, they are fulfilling the long-term commitment, but they are fulfilling this commitment. We have any problems with the supply. A little bit increase from the south, from the Slovakia. So probably because of the demand on the south of Poland, and probably because of the interruption of the supply from the different sources. Slovakia is a Slovnaft MOL group, and as they are present in the Poland through the subsidiary, probably they change a little bit stream of the supply, but the numbers are not significant. And while we see plus 100%, because these figures from Belarusian side, these figures, what I'm presenting you now, this is the April-May, so pandemic and post-pandemic period. Already we heard about the problems with the Belarusians' supply of the crude oil in the first quarter 2020. So there were almost no supply of the gas oil from Belarus starting from January up to March. And then when the supply restart, of course, they have a huge increase, 100%. But again, the volumes are not very big. So we are slowly recover as a Poland, and the market is recover. We are monitoring daily sales of our gas stations. So I can tell you that the numbers we see every day on the morning 8 a.m. is we are on the right track to have the same sales as before the pandemic, the period we are comparing. This is January to February, which I think is a positive trend. But again, the message for the countries which are already on the front of the second wave looks that we are very close, or even we are now on the face of the second wave, which is very, very challenging. So we are watching every day what is going on, how it can affect our business, how they will affect behavior of our customers. Thank you very much. Happy to answer for any questions.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm sure we've given everybody plenty of food for thought. I'd like to thank all our speakers for making this happen, for your time and such comprehensive presentations today. There is no time for questions, but let's take a few questions. I can see a question for Damir Khalmetov. Damir, can you hear me well?
Yes. Okay.
So there is a question regarding LNG and LPG suppliers. So with rapidly growing new infrastructure for LNG product, is it expected to see LPG seaborne trade declining?
Thanks a lot for the question. As you can see from my presentation, new LPG plants in West and East Siberia and Far East of Russia are independent, and only new project in Ust-Luga will be with LPG and LNG production. And we have a profit of LPG in Russia, and next 5 years we can expect growing of LPG export from 5 till 10 million per year.
Thank you, Damir. Unfortunately, we are running out of time already. We'll provide answers for all other questions with the webinar materials. Thanks again for joining. We look forward to seeing you again, both online and offline. Thanks for kicking off your day with us, and have a lovely week ahead. Take care.